I like to wait for the bald guy that comes in late and sits down, and then I turn that off. That's what I've been doing.
I've never spoken, I don't think, to that kind of a crowd, but I miss even like four people in a theater like that. Just four
I've
people.
seen you at a crowd that big when you were at that one of those last things you do every year. The one of the, what's the big
Yeah,
one? I'm
I
blanking
miss
on it.
places.
The movement, the movement, the podcast movement.
The movement. I hope to attend the movement this year. I hope
Yeah.
to see you there. I'm hopeful that I will have both of my shots by then, rabies and the croup, because I'm really looking forward to going. I missed going last year. We'll see.
Yes. All right. So we are here with Tom Webster from Edison Research. I've known Tom a long time. He's a fantastic man, very smart, very fancy. I like to call him fancy because I do think you're fancy. I
Try to
don't
be.
just everything
Yeah.
about you. You're smart. You're beautiful, well educated. Just you're the whole package. Before we got started with the Edison um, research, I wanted to ask you a couple questions, if that's okay. I guess
Sure.
that's why you're here for me to ask
It's
you
your show,
questions.
Mike.
Number one, tell me about your podcast because I was a big fan of. Was it the Friday Five? Was the name of it where you used to tell stories and
Oh
sing? And
yeah, I've had a
yeah, and
few. Yeah,
that
I've had
one,
a
but
few.
that one, I wrote up a whole thing to send to you and never had the balls to do it because I was so. Or did I? Did I ever send that to you?
I
You don't
don't think
remember?
you did. I don't think you
No.
did. Yeah.
It was so much fun writing that thing up. But anyway, sorry. But what happened to that? Why did you stop doing that one? That was a
Yeah, I
good one.
used to have a podcast called the Friday Five where I would ask people to give me 5 songs they could tell great stories about. Not their 5 favorite songs, but 5 songs they could tell great stories about. And I went through all of my friends, Mike, and my list. I have maybe, I don't know, 6 friends. And so I just ran out of people I know. And
Oh shit! I
yeah,
should
I
have
got
sent
really
it to you.
tired of booking guests. Like,
Yeah, it's a
you know,
pain.
everybody listening right now, booking guests is the worst. You know, it's the worst. And I just got really tired of it. So I
Yeah.
decided, I think I did about 30 shows, and I called it a season. It was a good season.
And there, you can't find them anymore. They're not up. You are they somewhere? Because I
I
went and
still,
kind of.
they still exist. Yeah. I still have them somewhere. I'm
Hmm.
not sure what happened to them, like hosting wise, but they're getting a little long in the tooth at this point. So
But then now, so then you were doing this Spotify one called the Deep Six, which I was really interested to hear
yeah.
how you produce that one. How is that done? Because it's just on
Yeah.
Spotify, right?
It's only on Spotify, and it only makes sense to listen to on Spotify Premium. And it was an experiment of sorts because with basically the Spotify Premium and Anchor partnership enabled you to put full length licensed music in your show. And not fully integrated, but you could at least have a voice link and then drop in a song, a voice link and then drop in a song. It only works in Spotify Premium, and it only works in the app. It doesn't work in the web version. And so if you're just listening to it on the web version or you're listening to it on Anchor, you get like 30-second clips of the songs, and it's a terrible experience. And you don't get anything anywhere else because you can only Spotify has those licenses. So I did it as an experiment. I'm still doing it. I'm churning out about, I would say, one a month at this point. But yeah, Deep Six, and it's basically exploring the musical connections between 6 seemingly unrelated songs to see how far down the rabbit hole we can go. And that one's been fun. It's fun to produce. It's very easy for me to produce. I wish I could do segues and kind of proper song to song production and things like that. But
It's
early
very
days.
interesting. Yeah, I was
Early
wondering how
days.
you did that. So it is done with the Anchor app. Then is how you do it.
Yeah, it's done with the Anchor app, but I do produce my vocal links with a music bed on my own because
And
you
then you
can't
just
do
drop
that
them
in
in.
Anchor, and I just drop them in. Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. Okay, so then Marketing Companion, you did that one for a long time.
I did Marketing
And
Companion for 6 years with Mark Schaefer. That show is still going on, so I think I did about 150 episodes of the Marketing Companion. He does that now with someone else, and I just creatively, after doing it for about 6 years, I felt like I had run my course. Mark has not run his course. It's still a great
yeah.
show, but Mike, you've known me for a long time. I stopped being interesting probably 10 years ago.
Oh no, that's not true.
So
That's not true at all.
I got nothing
Please.
left to give.
All right, then the Freenoter you do with Tamsin, your wife.
Yes, the Freenoter. Pretty proud of that show. That's a really good show. If of all the things that you're mentioning, the Freenoter at thefreenoter.com sprung from both my wife and I's. We both do a lot of public speaking. You wouldn't know it from the way I'm stumbling over this question. We both do a lot of public speaking. We've both done professional speaking, but more importantly, we both speak to build our businesses. And my wife works with a lot of speakers to help them shape their ideas. And so we had an idea to do a podcast called The Freenoter. It's like the Keynoter, but for people who don't get paid. Speaking basically for building your business and how to get better at that particular aspect of speaking. And that's just fun because I like doing a podcast with my wife and she's fun.
Yeah, she's smart. She's a smart lady. And the other one was, what's the other one you did? Oh, Tom reads his spam. Are you still doing that one, Tom?
When I get good spam, I'll drop one in. I wouldn't say I have any kind of regular cadence with that. I probably get 80 episodes of that too, of just me reading spam that I get. There was this time, Mike, and I don't get it anymore, but there was this time, there was a whole phase of spam where it was like a dictionary from hell. People would just send you a stream of random words from like a story, and they wouldn't make any sense at all. And it seemed like one sentence would be plucked from one story, sentence number two would be plucked from another story, and they'd be all strung together. I think just to see if you would open it, maybe, to see if you're susceptible to some future incursion. Right. But those were so hysterical that I read about 70 of those, and those are still up at tomreadsspam.com. And you're really digging into the depths of not necessarily my finest work, Mike, but here.
Well, I'll stop there. I just thought you're very creative in these things. They're all, I did listen to the Marketing Companion. I stopped listening when you were off the show, just because it was kind of my protest. But I don't think Mark Schaefer knows that I'm protesting. But anyway, all right, so let's get started. So you, I think that's probably enough of an introduction for you anyway, Tom. You do this study. Why don't you just talk about your study? Why don't you get flying? Why don't you just take off? Take off, Tom.
I'm just going to take off.
I'm going to go away, but I'll be here if you need me. Okay.
All right, Mike. I'll miss you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Well, now we're alone. So I've been with Edison Research since 2004. And even before that, in 1998, we started producing a study called the Infinite Dial, which, as it turns out now, is America's longest running study of media and technology. Back in 1998, it was tracking things like AOL Net Radio and Spinner and Live 365, which I think is still around. There really wasn't social media back then. Very few people had home internet access, let alone Wi-Fi. But we started tracking, general digital media trends and internet trends. I started working on the report back in 2004. I've kind of been the voice of it since 2005. And in 2006, we added podcasting to it. And it was really the first major study to cover podcasting. It's been the only study to cover it continuously. And we now have 15 years of data on that. What makes the Infinite Dial, I think, important and relevant in media research and certainly in podcasting are the lengths to which we go to make sure that it's projectable and representative of the U.S. population. We spend nearly $100,000 just in our hard costs, and we're the ones putting in the research labor to put this out there. It's a telephone survey, which is still the gold standard in survey research. Over half of the completes in the survey are with mobile phone, because most of us are now mobile phone only. And we match all of that to U.S. Census data and the data that we have for the percentage of the population who are mobile phone only, which, believe it or not, the source of that data is the CDC, because apparently the CDC wants to know how to get in touch with you in case there's, I don't know, a pandemic or something like that. So what I want to show you this year are some of the podcasting statistics that were really the highlight for some people of the Infinite Dial 2021. And as I mentioned, we've been covering podcasting since really 2006 was the first time we reported it. I remember speaking at the, I think it was the Portable Media Expo in Ontario, California, which became the Podcast New Media Expo, and one of the first real podcasting conferences. That was the first time I really kind of presented this data. But we've been tracking the familiarity of podcasting, the usage of podcasting. Someone just popped up. I was there. Maybe that was Mike who just popped. I think Mike was there. I'm pretty sure I met him at one of those really early things. So the first thing that we track in the Infinite Dial, and I'm going to show you here from 2006 until today, is the familiarity with the term podcasting. And today, that's 222 million Americans. Chances are you've met one. 78% of Americans 12 plus, and our research is 12 plus. are at least familiar with the term podcasting. And that doesn't mean they know exactly what podcasting is. There are misconceptions out there, but they're at least familiar with the term. And that's a lot of people, right? That is certainly a sign that the term itself is part of everyday parlance, everyday conversation. And there's obviously a gap between the percentage of humans who are familiar with the term and the percentage of humans who have listened to a podcast. And in that gap, there be dragons. And I may talk about that in the questions at the end. As far as who has listened to a podcast, well, we start with ever listened. And currently 57% of Americans 12 plus say they've ever listened to a podcast. And that's a low bar. They could have listened to one years ago and never returned, but that's about 162 million. We passed that 50% threshold a couple of years ago. More relevant, perhaps, is the percentage of Americans 12 plus who say they've listened to a podcast in the last month. And that number is now 41% of Americans 12 plus, or 116 million people. And that's a significant number, right? That is far more than the percentage of Americans 12 plus who currently ever use Twitter. It's far more than the percentage who currently ever use TikTok. There are any number of media brands, in fact, any social media brand, honestly, with the exception of Facebook and Instagram, and maybe one more, maybe Snapchat. Podcasting really exceeds all of those in terms of regular usage. And it's grown a lot. And you can see here, in the last 5 years is when that rate of growth has really increased. It was fairly flat. It would grow a little bit, kind of dribs and drabs year over year when we first started tracking this. But then really about 5 years ago, 6 years ago even, you had the advent of Serial, which was at least one of the things that got people talking about podcasts, that accelerated interest in podcasts, that accelerated investment into podcasts. And with that came talent, with that came content, and mass appeal content. And then that's really what has drawn more and more people into the space today. In terms of the percentage of Americans from a gender standpoint, male and female, who listen to podcasts, right now 43% of men are monthly podcast consumers and 39% of women are monthly podcast consumers. When we first started doing this research, and I'll skip ahead here real quick to show you how the gender of monthly podcast consumers compares to the U.S. population. It's pretty close, right? In the U.S. population is about 48% male, 49% female, 2% non-binary or other. And the percentage of monthly podcast consumers really, really close to that. When we first started reporting on podcasting, and really in the earliest days of podcasting, back when I think I met Mike at one of those early events, a lot of podcasts were two white dudes talking about internet routers, and the demographics of podcasts, podcast consumption really reflected that. But today, of course, that's very, very different. There's a lot more diverse content, and that has attracted a much more diverse audience. Similarly, there has been growth in really all three age demographics over the years that we track here: 12 to 34, 35 to 54, and 55 plus. I'm really just showing you the last 4 years here. But what's kind of interesting about really the recent growth, it's really been at the edges. That doesn't mean that 35 to 54 has not added humans. They've added a lot more humans over that period of time, as you saw in the monthly graph that I showed you before. It's just that at the edges, at the youngest end, and at 55 plus, it's growing even faster. And maybe a better way to look at that is to look at this graph here, which shows the composition of podcast consumers, which, as you can see, it's really been the edges that have grown in terms of share, in terms of the composition. But we've also put, the raw numbers in there, the millions of listeners in each of those demographics. And you can see even in that middle demographic, which looks like from a composition standpoint, it's shrinking, was 40% 10 years ago. Now it's 29%. It's gone from 12 million humans to 34 million humans. It's just that the edges have grown a little faster. On the older end, I think that's really down to a couple of things. First of all, again, there's more diverse content in the space. But also when podcasting started, it was very much in that middle group, in that 35 to 54 group was really the strongest group for podcasting when it first started. And frankly, a lot of those people now, 15 years on, are in that 55 plus bracket. So they've sort of aged into it. On the other hand, on the youngest end, where you see 18 to 34, 12 to 34, that's really grown a lot. The principal cause for that, believe it or not, has been Spotify. There have been other causes. It's not the sole cause, but Spotify has become really a strong number two, and in many cases, number one platform in terms of podcast playback. And they have done a really good job in the last 2 or 3 years showcasing podcast content to their constituency, which is overwhelmingly on the young end. They're definitely the leader on the young end in terms of the streaming services. And so they've really highlighted podcasting in front of that audience and done a lot to increase the growth there. Another thing that we've seen in podcasting, I mentioned before that the early podcasts were very much male, pale, and stale, like Mike and I. But again, just as the content has gotten more and more diverse and that diverse content has been showcased and spotlighted, the audience for podcasting is now much more diverse. And in fact, the audience for podcasting in terms of the monthly podcast listener are more diverse than the American population. The US population is about 60% white and 40% non-white. If you look here, podcasting has kind of migrated over the past decade to be 57% white and 43% non-white, which again, a drop more diverse than the population. And that's really driven on the young end again, because younger Americans are overwhelmingly more likely to be non-white. About 50% of Americans 16 and under are non-white, which leads the population. So again, as more younger people get into podcasting, you can expect to see those trends start to continue. But we have seen podcasting become much more diverse, especially amongst Hispanics and Latinos in this country, where that group has grown, at least in terms of composition, considerably, even in just the last 5 years. In terms of weekly podcast listening, this is really where we're getting into the people for whom podcasting is a habit. It's something that they regularly do. Really significant growth here year over year. It's gone from 24% to 28%. And that really, over the history of podcast consumption from a weekly standpoint, very significant growth indeed. And that's now 80 million Americans. And it won't be long before that figure hits 100 million Americans who are listening to at least one podcast every week. And that's going to put it in some very rarefied air, I think, in terms of a mainstream medium. I'll show you a couple more slides from the Infinite Dial. Then I'm going to close with another piece of research that I think you'll all be interested in. A couple of sort of pieces of trivia here about the podcast listener. The average podcast listener listens to about 5 different podcasts per week. And that's not episodes. I'll get to that, but actual individual shows. Now, obviously, that's the average, and there are certainly a significant percentage who listen to 10 or more different podcasts. But if you think about the average human, the average listener in this country has the mental shelf space for about 5 shows. And for many Americans, one of those is some kind of daily news podcast. So you don't really have that many slots in the American brain to get to in terms of a regular show to be listened to. But that's the number of shows per week that podcast consumers listen to. The number of episodes overall is 8. So that's about 1.6 episodes per show. Certainly that's driven by daily news podcasts, which have a significant amount to do with that. Can also be driven by podcasts that are sort of released in binge drops, people catching up with one of the many true crime podcasts that we have. And in fact, there will be a murder today on this particular podcast, I hope, because those are the most popular podcasts after daily news. So weekly podcast consumers listen to 5 shows a week, 8 episodes from those shows every week. And that really forms sort of the bedrock statistics of what the podcast consumer is doing in America today. And I want to give you just a couple more quick stats here before I end and open things up for questions. I know for many of you, this is a lunch and learn. It's 3 p.m. for me. So I guess it's tea and crumpets for me here in Boston. But I'm certainly happy to take some questions at the end of this. First, we do a study every quarter called Share of Ear. Share of Ear is America's only single source measure of all forms of audio, online and offline. It is the only research that compares everything kind of on the same scale, whether that's AM, FM radio or audiobooks or listening to your own 8 tracks, all of that audio, we measure all of that in Share of Ear. And I want to point out that over the this is now the 7th year of Share of Ear. Over those years that we have been doing this research, the share of spoken word audio has increased over that period of time. When we first started doing Share of Ear back in 2014, about 80% of all of the audio that we listened to as a function of time was music and 20% spoken word audio. Today, that's 74 and 26. And that is actually a significant shift. This is not a number that we would expect to shift a great deal. We mostly listen to mostly music. But over that period of time, that balance has changed. And the thing that has changed that balance more than anything has been podcasting. And also, COVID has changed that a little bit. One of the questions that we asked in a recent study that we did with NPR, the spoken word audio report from NPR and Edison, we asked people, as a result of COVID-19, are you listening to spoken word audio more or less or about the same? And you can see here, overwhelmingly more people said more than less. I think as we seek the human voice, as we seek companionship. But again, many of those habits that we have developed during quarantine are going to stick, I think, well after we get back to some semblance of normality, at least in terms of our transit. And the final graph I want to show you is the most recent quarterly graph from Share of Ear. It's a significant daily diary project, Share of Ear. The sample every quarter is 4,000 people who are asked to complete either an online or an offline diary, where every 15 minutes, basically, they write down what, if anything, they listened to, what brand it was, what device they used, where they were when they listened to it, and other kinds of information. They're, of course, compensated to do that. And every quarter, we take those 4,000 responses and we code them. And because it's a large sample project, these numbers don't jump around a whole lot. But over time, they've changed. And today, this is the current kind of lay of the land in terms of Share of Ear. And I want to unpack this graph just a little bit. These are not percentages of humans. These are percentages of the amount of time that we spend listening to audio content, which is about 4 hours per day. So today, 39% of that 4 hours per day amongst Americans 13 plus is spent listening to AM/FM radio content. And that could be content that is actually on an AM/FM radio, or that could be the simulcast stream of an AM/FM radio station. In practice, though, it's almost all delivered via an actual radio. So today, that's 39%. When we first started Share of Ear back in 2014, that number was 52%. So it has steadily declined, decreased in, I guess, importance in terms of the overall Share of Ear, but it's still the plurality. It's still the single largest slice here. Going kind of around the donut chart, as we like to call it, streaming audio is now 18%, was 11% back in 2014. Owned music, which is your own music files, that could be, MP3 files, that could be vinyl, cassettes are back, weirdly. CDs, obviously, digital music files of any kind. That's now 11% of our listening. That's gone down by over a third in the last 6 or 7 years as we get more comfortable kind of not owning our music and listening instead to things like Spotify and Pandora. YouTube as an audio only source is 10% of our listening. That's double what it was when we first started Share of Ear. Satellite radio is at 8%, and podcasting is at 6%. And that may sound like a small number to you. By no means is it a small number, because, again, this counts all Americans, many of whom have yet to listen to podcasts. So there's a lot of zeros being averaged in there. But I mentioned when we first started Share of Ear that AM/FM radio was at 52%. At that time, podcasting was at 2%. So the ratio of podcasting to radio back in 2014, I was just a boy then, was 1 to 26, basically. And today, with podcasts at 6% and AM/FM radio at 39%, it's more like 1 to 7. So that ratio has changed considerably over just 6 or 7 short years. And that 6% is indicative of hundreds of millions of hours of audio consumed every single day by Americans. So podcasting has changed the landscape of audio. It's helped to shift the balance of audio power somewhat towards spoken word and away from music a little bit. And all of that has contributed, I think, to where podcasting is today, which is a major mainstream medium, one that is increasingly well-funded, one that puts food on my family, and maybe for some of you, on your family as well. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll hand things back over to the gracious host today, Mike McCallan, my friend, and see if there are any questions, or if or just
Thank you, Tom. Tom, that was fantastic as usual. It is so interesting. I was at that event in Ontario years ago, and it was very fun. And it is interesting. Those people I met there, you go to conferences, but you make friends with people. And that one, I have so many friends from, because we were such a small niche of people, a niche of people.
Niche, as the French would say. Yeah.
Yes. I'm an Irish American, so I don't say. Anyway, but that was a fantastic conference, because it was just a small group of podcasters from the Podcast Brothers who actually put that on.
That's right, the Podcast Brothers.
Yeah. I wonder what happened to them.
I don't know. Well, they sold the whole shebang, but I don't remember what they weren't they both like cops, or one of them was, or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. They had that kind of the problem with Adam Curry, and because he was smoking weed everywhere, and they were like against that. That was a weird dynamic.
Well, those are weird days. I mean, and now we're in this sort of time of big podcasting, which you've certainly been involved with. Those are many of my clients, and I'm grateful for all of that, because I'm a market researcher by trade. I could be researching toilet paper, but instead, I get to make a living doing this, and that's not all bad.
Yeah, and it's pretty fantastic to hear about how it's completely evolving, and also like changing so much when you had your Share the Ear up. It's interesting because your podcast just isn't. Well, in 2014, it was like you had to jump through hoops to get a podcast. You couldn't just go to your phone and go. Was it in iTunes by then?
It was still iTunes then.
Was it in iTunes though? But it was it was your
yeah, it was in iTunes. It was in iTunes on the iPhone at the time. But of course, when we started, back in, I think, 05, 06, you of course had to download a podcast as a file on your hard drive and then sync it to an iPod, which for our younger viewers, an iPod is like an iPhone that doesn't call anyone. And of course, iPods are essentially gone, and everything is essentially on demand at this point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But now, like, you can put it on Spotify, and it's just the whole what is a podcast conversation comes up with some people, and it's when you show that dial, I think the Share the Ear, I think, oh, that's interesting, because the streaming, isn't that a podcast too? Not that we need to go down this road, but it was just like,
that graph is a simplified version of what is a very complicated survey instrument that we use, because it is getting more and more difficult. And for Spotify, for example, we do have our respondents distinguish between a podcast that they're listening to on Spotify and then just kind of the regular music content. But of course, in the strictest technical sense of the term, if a podcast is on Spotify, it's no longer a podcast. And that sort of brings up the one great exception, the one great defier of the law of podcasting, and that is Joe Rogan, which I think as we do regularly, if you ask a sample of Americans what their favorite podcast is, the number one response is going to be the Joe Rogan Experience. That's been that way for a long time, and it's not even close as far as what's number two. But as of December, there is no such thing as the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. It is only available as a show on Spotify. But of course, it's taken this long to educate the majority of Americans about what a podcast even is. I'm not sure we want to relitigate that at this point and tell them that they're wrong. So
and he was on Ustream to start out with. I remember watching him years ago on Ustream before he had. I don't even, was it a podcast then? Anyway, I don't know. That doesn't matter. George has a question. George Coster has a question here for you. It is, can Tom break down the top 10 podcast content formats?
I actually can do that. Nice. Not off the top of my head. Let me see. Since you asked.
Well, that's disappointing, but okay.
I know, well, yeah. I mean, I can tell you that number one is comedy. That's about as far as I can go. I'll see if I can pull that up quickly. But we have been tracking. We have another product, which is a subscription product called the Podcast Consumer Tracker. And that is the only measure of the entire industry, basically. There's a lot of good download measurement products out there. which measure the companies that participate in those download measures. Joe Rogan, for instance, doesn't participate in either one of them or in any of them. But the podcast consumer tracker that we offer as a subscription product does in fact track all of that. I'm going to say this, George. I'm not going to print this or post this. You're getting privileged information just because I know Mike. But that top 10 is comedy, society and culture, news, sports, true crime, arts, business, TV and film, religion and spirituality, health and fitness. And by far it's comedy. And certainly Rogan is a big chunk of that, but which is great. I mean, again, if I were to have given you that list back in 2006, it would have been very technical. There would have been a lot of podcasts about podcasts. And that's fine. That's the origin of the medium, but not necessarily a mass appeal one, right? But there's still obviously a podcast for everybody, and that's what I love about it.
Yeah, there really is. My family has now entered my home, so be careful if I'm attacked.
Well, bring them on, Mike.
I think it's very interesting too when we talk about all these podcasts, and I've had conversations with clients of my own saying, there's so many podcasts out there, and when you start to think about it, how many of us have started podcasts, and we have 10 podcasts on 20 podcasts on iTunes, but then they're they're pod faded or gone. It's an interesting thought.
I'm going to stop you right there, Mike, because I think I'm going to tell you I hate the word pod faded, and I hate it. Yeah, and I've done 4 different podcasts, and I don't think any one of them are still ongoing at the moment, although Deep Six is still trickling in there. I think the term pod faded is a stigma that gets attached to podcasting that gets attached to nothing else. Here are some other things that have pod faded: Seinfeld, Cheers, The Wire. Like I can name show after show after show that ran for 1 season, ran for 10 seasons, ran for 7 seasons, and then it's done. It's a great show. It ran its course. It exists. It's still out there. But I still see all these articles written about people starting a podcast and then quitting it, or podcasts that quote unquote pod faded. But really, we don't attach that stigma to almost any other kind of media. You're not under any great obligation to keep your show going in perpetuity. You can end a show, you can start a new show. And that's, I think, part of the joy of the medium. As you learn new things, rip it up and do something else.
Right.
Everything fades.
Well, I was talking
even
like
your good looks,
3
Mike,
shows,
not
like 3 shows, 2 shows, 3 shows. That's kind of a pod fade. Would you not think that? Or
it depends on what look. It depends if you said what you had to say in those 1, 2, or 3 shows, then you did 1, 2, or 3 shows, right? There's nothing that says you need to have a certain number of shows for us to take it seriously as a podcast.
What I was saying though too is, like, I talk to people and they say I don't want to do a podcast because there's so many podcasts out there. Is kind of the
that is true.
That came from. Yeah. So, but there isn't really. I mean, there is a lot, but there's not really compared to other things. I mean, if
I just to put it in perspective, I will agree with you, but then I will throw some poop onto the fire. The thing that I will agree with you in, I know. Thing that I will agree with you about is
throws poop on the fire. I've never heard that.
I don't know. I don't know. It's
is that a old Webster brought down from the ages?
Look, I'm a Webster. I make up the words. But there are about a year and a half ago, there were 1 million podcasts extant in history, if you add them all up. Today, it's like 2 million. I think it's doubled in about 15 months. But the number of self-published books alone in the last year was over 1 million. That's self-published books in a year. And we're talking about that number of podcasts throughout all of history. So, there's room for your podcast. But the caution to that, though, is that no one is entitled to an audience. And whenever someone asks me, how can I, my podcast isn't getting heard, it's not getting listened to, it's getting drowned out by all these bigger podcasts. No one's entitled to an audience. You don't deserve an audience. You don't deserve an audience, no matter how great you think your topic is or how underserved what you're talking about is. You don't deserve one. you have every much of a right to earn one as anybody else. But it's not an easy thing to do. And whenever anyone asks me, what is the number one piece of advice you would give me to build my audience? I would tell you to get better at your craft. I would tell you not to worry about marketing and promotions. I would get better at your craft. And I don't think that there is a podcaster listening to this, and maybe not a podcaster alive today, that can't get a lot better at their craft.
I agree. And I have that conversation with my clients and prospective clients constantly. Don't worry about your equipment. Don't worry about anything, but just worry about what your show is going to be about. What are the goals of your show? And then how can you make people listen to it? So it is just spending that time on the content. That's why I don't have a show actually now, Tom, because I can't put together anything that I think anyone would listen to.
Me neither.
Or the time to do it, really. Actually, that's it. If I just can't commit to it just yet. I'm working on different things, but that's my hardest thing.
I can't do it. I can't make a commitment right now to make something that would live up to my standards. So, I really can't. Like I have standards, and right now I'm not able to put out something that would live up to those standards. So my podcast strategy is to be on everybody else's. So thanks for having me.
That's been my fun. I have fun with my clients and the people I'm helping, just doing that same thing. Like, let's really hammer down this thing.
Yeah.
And it's fun.
Yeah.
They want to do it. They have that niche they're trying to attack. So, but I don't really have a niche. I don't think. I need to find one. Where's my niche?
I don't know. You look like you're in a basement. There's got to be a niche in the basement.
I am in the basement. This is where I live. I've spent COVID in this basement.
Nice.
Are you jealous? You don't have a basement, do you?
I don't have a basement. I don't have that many more rooms besides the one that you see behind me. I live in a, I suppose it's hip to call them a tiny house. I live in a tiny house in the sky. I live in an apartment building.
A deluxe apartment in the sky.
A deluxe apartment in the sky in Boston, Massachusetts. So it's a tiny house in the sky. And, there's only so much around me in terms of places to live. So that's been fun.
Oh God, it's crazy times. And so what happens with this research after you do this? You give the talks, tell me more about, you've been doing this forever, and I'm sorry if I don't know more about it, but what is the reasoning for this research? Is it, I know you give it out freely, but you also sell it?
We don't. Yeah. So the Infinite Dial, we always give out free. You don't even have to register or email. It's just, you go to edisonresearch.com. And you can have it. And as I mentioned, it's an enormously expensive piece of research to do, but it drives two separate things for Edison, both of which are very important. It drives, sort of obviously there's a marketing and PR angle to it. It drives our audio business. Many of the, today I'm very pleased to call all, most of the quote unquote big podcasting entities you can think of as clients of ours, either for our syndicated studies like the podcast consumer tracker or share of ear, or bespoke work on their audience or brand lift research. Doing private client research is a big part of my day. And the Infinite Dial is sort of the promotional engine that has brought in a lot of that business. And so that's been a good story. But on the side you don't see, the thing about the Infinite Dial is it is cited not just by media companies, but it's also the chief source for a lot of data by nonprofit organizations like Pew. I'm sure people have heard of Pew, PEW. They use our data instead of producing their own for things like podcasting, because the way that we do it, because we use really the gold standard for survey research, enormously expensive, but representative. It's the only way to really get something that's truly projectable to the U.S. population, even the offline population, doing the way that we do it, because we take those pains and spend that money. We're able to use all of the data that we collect in the Infinite Dial to calibrate and weight our other studies throughout the course of the year. So, anybody can do a study on SurveyMonkey and sort of be happy with what you get. But with the data that we collect in the Infinite Dial, we have credible estimates, not just for the sort of general numbers, but also the size of the demographic groups, the gender groups, education groups, and things like that, so that when we do other surveys throughout the year, we have something to weight that data to kind of snap it into something that makes sense in terms of the U.S. population. So, it forms the public-facing arm of our audio business, but it's also the underpinnings of a lot of our survey research. It's sort of the quality ingredients that go into many of the pies that we bake, I think, is the way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty interesting stuff that you do. I mean, you're always every article I read, there's a Tom Webster quote these days. To
There's a lot of Tom
subscribe or
Webster
not to
stuff.
subscribe. There's a lot of Tom Webster out there.
It's a lot of Tom Websters out there.
What? No, the Tom Webster is you. There's a country singer too, right? Is there another or something like that? Another
There's
big Tom
there's
Webster?
an NHL hockey Hall of Famer coach. There's a beekeeper expert. There's a professor in nanotechnology just down the road from me at Northeastern, and I get all of his conference invitations. Every week I'll get a conference invitation from somebody in like Tokyo or Kuala Lumpur to come speak about nanotechnology, and I say yes to all of them. Someday they'll figure this out. I don't know, but it's something, I can just give my normal talk, but I'll just give it with really, really small slides.
That would be a great podcast, that you just go to all these conferences. And
that I just go to all these as Dr. Tom Webster, nanotechnology expert.
Yes, or any Tom Webster that you get invited to, beekeeping conference, whatever it is.
The Tom Webster Week podcast. Yeah. Probably be interesting to my mother, my wife, maybe my son. Probably not. That's about it.
I'd listen to it. I think it would be fun.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You're a friend.
Okay. So I appreciate you, Tom, for coming on and talking to the group. A lot of people watch it afterwards on the YouTube channel because it is a weird middle of the day thing for people sometimes. But we used to do these in the evenings live for about 3 years, which were really fun. And then this pandemic happened. So I was banished to my basement here. So I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. I hope you get out of that basement someday.
I will someday. And then before we go, what are some of the other things? You have a newsletter, right?
I do. That's really where I do kind of my best thinking every week. That's at tomwebster.substack.com. It's called I Hear Things. It's largely about podcasting, but it's generally about anything that we listen to. So I've talked a little bit about Clubhouse, about streaming, even a little bit about radio, but it's mostly about podcasting.
Cool. And have you spent a lot of time on Clubhouse?
I've sort of been on and off it a little bit. I think I spend more time looking at what other people are doing on Clubhouse, and I've been on some rooms. Again, I've been a guest on some people's Clubhouse rooms and things like that. I wouldn't say that I'm incredibly bullish about Clubhouse, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of excitement about it, but it's at the moment it's not much more than a feature on your phone. It wouldn't surprise me if Apple bought it for that.
Yeah. I enjoy sometimes when I'm in the yard or picking up dog do or something, I'll pop it on and listen in. It's interesting sometimes, but a lot of the time it seems like a contest of just who talks the most or something. I don't know. It's not my kind of thing. I'm more of a sit there and listen. Voyeur, I guess. Is that
second poop reference?
Yes.
On the show.
Got to keep those up. Hey, George has another question for you quick before we go.
Sure.
What's Tom's thoughts on Apple producing their own shows?
Big part of their strategy to get everybody to subscribe to their consolidated subscription offering. So it won't surprise me if they do it. I think Apple at this point is as much a services company as anything else. So it wouldn't surprise me if, just as Amazon has done with audio, if Apple bundles premium audio in with what they're doing. I think there has been some news in the past couple of weeks about upcoming builds of iOS. The podcast app is going to do away with the word subscribe, and instead you're going to follow podcasts just like you do in Spotify, just like you do in the Stitcher app. And that's, I think, follow is the word of the future for free podcasts. And I think that's probably paving the way for them to use subscribe for the way that we normally think of subscribe. And that is a thing that you pay for. And of course, that really remains to be seen what kind of content they can come up with. I think Apple Plus TV content, they've had a few hits that I think would draw you in. I think really their best chance for producing original audio content would be to combine some of the success they've had with their most successful original TV, along with really the most successful recent genres in podcasting, and come up with the Murdering Ted Lasso podcast. I think the Murdering Ted Lasso podcast, or some way to kill Ted Lasso, or figure out who killed Ted Lasso, I think is probably what's going to drive that whole business.
Do you think they'll do that? Because they make so much money. Is it just a little blip on their, I don't know.
Well, I think
they haven't done anything all these years. They've done nothing, and they're making gobs of money. They are a business, right?
They are, but there comes a point where they are very much in the services business, and there's something, and this is a phenomenon that we are studying right now. If everything you want is available on Spotify, for instance, do you ever leave Spotify? If everything you want is available on Netflix, do you ever leave Netflix? And so it becomes a little bit of an arms race. If there is a better place for me to get my podcasts, will I ever use Apple Music? Will I ever use Apple Plus? Will I ever use the Apple Podcast app? So it's a little bit of an arms race, right? I mean,
kind of the Amazon of the world. You just go to Amazon, right? For everything.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So they may feel like it's part of just, the kind of the Red Queen theory of evolution, where you always keep running just to stay in one place. They may feel like they need to do that. But it also, like, at some point, the value proposition of Amazon Prime became just too compelling for people to say no to. The vast majority of Americans subscribe to Amazon Prime right now. I don't know if people know that or not, but it is the majority of Americans, because at some point that value proposition just became way too overwhelming. And, for some people, maybe that'll be audio as well. I don't know.
Huh. Interesting. All right, Tom, thank you. I appreciate you.
Thank you,
I hope we run into each other someday again in person.
I hope so. I want to give you an awkward, because you're taller than me, hug. And hopefully I will be vaccinated before I do that.
I could lift you up, and we could, if you wanted, just to get that out now.
That would be, I think, a future episode.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I want to be respectful of people's times. I know it's lunchtime out here, and we were going to go. And thanks again, Tom.
Cheers. Thank you, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.